Strange Archives, File 002, Mystery Flesh Pit National Park. A national park, tickets, brochures, and beneath the trails, a living organism. This is the file of the park that breathed. A national park promises something fairly simple. A vast territory, but one that can be read. Trails, maps, rules, and the idea that if you follow those rules, you can approach the abyss without belonging to it. Mystery Flesh Pit National Park repeated that promise almost word for word. Except here, the territory was not a mountain. It was not a forest. It was not even a cave. It was a living organism, buried beneath Texas, large enough to hold roads, elevators, shops, a control center, hotels, visitors, and all the reassuring signage that comes with them. For almost 30 years, people descended into it the way they might visit a canyon. They bought a ticket. They followed a ranger. They kept the brochure in their pocket. They looked at a map that said, "You are here." In an ordinary park, that phrase is comforting. In the Mystery Flesh Pit, it should already have been disturbing. Because here was not ground. It was an internal zone, a piece of body. A place whose shape, depth, and temperament never depended on engineers alone. On July 4, 2007, that fiction of control broke. Rain cancelled the concert and the fireworks. To keep visitors on site, the park stayed open until midnight. At 8 p.m., the normal closing time passed. But underground, there were still families, employees, tour groups, and reduced night crews. At 9:51 p.m., the lights went out for 45 seconds. When they came back, the public address system warned no one. The park was still open. The alert program had stopped at the scheduled closing time, 8 p.m. 1 minute later, the report was no longer speaking the language of an attraction. It was speaking of choking action, of a body contracting, of human infrastructure caught inside something its owners had learned to sell before they had learned to understand. So before we tell the story of the catastrophe, we have to ask the colder question. What had Anodyne, the state, the visitors, the brochures, and the maps agreed to call a park? The file begins there. Not with the tickets, with the organism. In the documents, the most stable name is Permian Basin Superorganism. It is not a species name. It is almost an admission. Something lives under the Permian Basin, but the usual categories are not enough to hold it. Its origin remains uncertain. So does its age. The sources describe a very old organism, perhaps hundreds of thousands of years old, perhaps older. But whenever the file tries to give a precise date, it becomes cautious. Even its size resists a simple sentence. The park was not built on an animal one could measure from end to end. It gave access to a branching system, passages, cavities, respiratory zones, digestive organs, vascular networks, secondary orifices. In 1976, explorers had already reached 12,117 meters below the main orifice. In 1979, a new record passed 19,000 meters. During the 2007 catastrophe, movements were reported far from the site, sometimes 30 to 120 kilometers from the entrance. At that scale, asking, "How large is it?" is almost like asking how large a storm is. You can describe the points of impact, not necessarily the whole body. The surviving archives are not a complete biological study. They are prospecting letters, company reports, business cards, brochures, safety instructions, accident reviews. They say less about what the superorganism is than about what human beings wanted to do with it. Excavate it, name it, pump it, cross it, sedate it, sell it. The first truly human trace in the file is not a brochure. It is a letter. In the spring of 1973, James Bernard Jackson writes from near Gumption, Texas. His crews have found an opening that does not behave like a cavity. It breathes. It bleeds. It descends farther than their measurements can follow. In the letters, the vocabulary hesitates. Deposit, formation, mouth, site. Jackson does not have a species in front of him. He has an entrance, and very quickly, a possibility of extraction. The first men understood the danger before the danger had an official name. In the Jackson letters, the pit is not yet an attraction. It is a mouth into which men descend with lamps, cables, cages, and prayers they do not quite admit to saying. At roughly 1,800 feet below the orifice, the crews are no longer observing the anomaly from the edge. They are inside it. The walls seep. The structures resemble bone. Heat, humidity, pump noise, and internal movement become the normal conditions of work. Very early, the file mentions deaths. Not at the end. Not after a long period of tourist carelessness. At the beginning. The mystery flesh pit was not safe before it became dangerous. It was dangerous from the first descents. When Anodyne deep earth mining enters the story, the opening changes scale. A mouth becomes an industrial access point. Flesh becomes a set of resources. Amniotic ballast, blue tissue, corpusite, oscurolite, black bone. The names sound technical. That is their purpose. They isolate a piece of the body, give it value, and make its extraction presentable in a table. Behind every line, there is still a cut, a sample, a pump, a crew going back underground. Andre Martinez's testimony matters because it removes that cleanliness. He does not describe a grand adventure. He describes a job, shifts, instructions, boots slipping, fluids too close. Men descending because there is pay, a crew, a supervisor, a schedule. That is where the pit becomes truly administrable. Not when it becomes less strange, when it enters the calendar. An accident becomes a form. An injury becomes a note. A descent becomes a procedure. And once a living mouth can become a workplace, the next step does not have to be reasonable. It only has to be profitable. The transition from worksite to park does not look like sudden madness. It looks like an administrative conversion. Plans laid out on a table, colored zones, reinforced access points, words replaced by other words. A mouth becomes an entrance. Intestines become trails. Cavities become rooms. Survival instructions become a safety brochure. In October 1975, Jackson is still answering environmental criticism. He defends Anodyne, minimizes the accusations, and treats the idea of public exploitation as an exaggerated concern. 1 year later, tickets are being sold. The detail matters. The pit does not become calm between 1975 and 1976. The interface around it becomes polished. Railings are installed. What needs to be seen is illuminated. Routes are drawn. Maps are produced with the grammar of every other park map. You are here. You can go there. You can return this way. Inside an unknown organism, that sentence is almost an act of administrative magic. It turns a portion of flesh into public space. It gives the descent the appearance of a supervised experience. The visitor is not descending into a mouth. The visitor is entering an attraction. The difference rests on very little: a ticket, a line, an orientation film, a ranger who knows where to point the flashlight. In April 1980, integration into the national park system adds another layer of respectability. The language of America's great landscapes settles over the superorganism buried beneath Texas. From then on, the pit is no longer merely exploited. It is recommended, photographed, described after vacation. People no longer ask why anyone opened the mouth. They ask which route to choose. The hardest part of this file to look at is not only the catastrophe. It is the period when everything works. Gumption reorganizes itself around the orifice. Motels, gas stations, restaurants, shops, seasonal jobs. The town receives the families before the body receives them in turn. Through the 1980s and 1990s, the park finds its rhythm. The tunnels are reinforced. The air is conditioned. The lower visitor center becomes a piece of civilization suspended in flesh. Stores, control center, access to deeper zones, monorail, services. Tourism is no longer selling only the rarity of the place. It is selling the proof that the place has been tamed. Amniotic spas, rooms inside the organism, guided excursions, souvenirs, vacation photographs. The flesh remains at the center, but it is wrapped in comfort. Plan your stay. Choose your route. Follow the instructions. Enjoy the experience. That normality depends on very low, very material things: relays, supports, cables, pumps, maintenance crews, injections capable of calming the body when it reacts. Every attraction rests on a permanent negotiation with the organism. And the more money the park makes, the more that negotiation has to hold. Even in the rain, even with aging equipment, even when the day should have ended. The warnings do not arrive as omens. They arrive as an inspection. On September 30th, 2004, an internal Anodyne report discusses hydrochloric corrosion and maintenance strategies. In an ordinary park, corrosion is a budget line. In the mystery flesh pit, it is the environment itself attacking the guarantees. Cables fatigue. Supports degrade. Relays age. Pumps work in a humidity that always gains ground. The catastrophe report would later state that some recommendations had not been properly implemented. The sentence is short. It does not need to be more dramatic. Meanwhile, the public image continues. The monorail arrives after delays. The brochures become cleaner. The internal resort still promises warmth, relaxation, care, rare experience. On one side, the promise becomes more refined. On the other, the technical organs take on water. July 4, 2007 does not erupt inside an innocent park. It arrives inside a system that already knew it was aging. On the morning of July 4, rain falls over the Permian Basin. At 10:29 a.m., the report notes abnormally heavy precipitation. The concert is canceled. So are the fireworks. On the surface, there is a disappointed crowd, full parking lots, and a holiday that has lost its spectacle. Management chooses to extend opening hours until midnight. The decision appears commercial before it appears insane. Keep the visitors, absorb the frustration, turn the weather into extra hours of visitation. Underground, however, that decision changes the weight of the entire evening. At 8 p.m., the park should have been emptying. It remains active. Night crews take over with fewer people. Visitors are still moving through the system. Some shops close, but the routes are not empty. At 9:16 p.m., farther west inside the superorganism, extraction teams break a record while chasing bonus quotas. That same evening, the pit is still both park and mine. Families in the corridors, machines elsewhere in the body. One anatomy asked to support it all. At 9:30 p.m., a system test detects a relay fault tied to electrical demand. At 9:41 p.m., rainwater is accumulating in the sand gullet. The automatic pumps do not start. At 9:42 p.m., the emergency pump fails to respond as well. Corrosion, under-lubrication, a component that should have remained ordinary until the moment it becomes decisive. At 9:48 p.m., the sand gullet is nearly submerged. Water reaches respiratory zones. In the control center, the crisis does not arrive as a revelation. It arrives in fragments. A radio crackling. A silent sensor. A technician repeating that the pump will not start. A ranger asking whether a group is still inside a section. At 9:51 p.m., the relay is repaired. The network comes back. A 45-second blackout. The lights return. But the public announcement never comes, not because the danger is absent, because the system was programmed around normal closing time, 8 p.m. In some corridors, visitors think it was a brief outage. In others, rangers are already walking faster. And inside the body, something answers. At 9:52 p.m., the report notes a choking action. The phrase is cold, almost medical. It does not describe an attack. It describes a reflex. The superorganism contracts around the water, the structures, the rails, the visitors, and everything installed inside it. Walkways tremble. Walls tighten. The dorsal trunk flexes violently. At 9:53 p.m., the supports of the lower visitor center partially fail. The structure tilts by about 20 degrees. On a tourist map, 20 degrees means nothing. Inside an underground building full of visitors, it is a fall beginning. At 9:54 p.m., the master alarm is triggered. At 9:56 p.m., rangers are sent toward partially collapsed tunnels and trails. They do not yet know how many groups are isolated. They only know that communications are becoming irregular. At 10:03 p.m., the exit elevator jams. More than 24 visitors remain between the surface and the underground park. The report does not linger. A motionless cabin, emergency lights, questions no one can answer cleanly. At 10:12 p.m., the automatic system injects 20,000 liters of aconitine. The purpose is to calm the body, to buy time, to limit the reaction. But the tremors intensify. At 10:15 p.m., an internal junction opens. A flow of lactogastric chyme is released into the dorsal trunk. At 10:16 p.m., it rises toward the surface. At 10:17 p.m., the pit ejects through the main orifice. Organic matter erupts above the site. Debris falls onto the parking lots. Vehicles are crushed. Windows shatter. At 10:19 p.m., massive movements are reported far from the entrance. Extremities appear dozens of kilometers away. At that moment, the park is no longer the location of the catastrophe. It is only one access point. At 10:25 p.m., the smell reaches Odessa. At 10:27 p.m., vehicles trying to climb out are crushed or pulled into a digestive organ. Rescue teams arrive in the rain. A field hospital is set up. They speak of industrial sedation. They speak of containment. They no longer speak of reopening. At 10:58 p.m., the Pentagon receives authorization to consider nuclear force if the superorganism becomes active or ambulatory. At 11:02 p.m., a contingency measure is activated. The report leaves it partly opaque. At 11:05 p.m., the lower visitor center collapses completely. At 11:19 p.m., one group is found. The report remains sober. So should we. The park never reopens. The mouth does not disappear. After 2007, the word park recedes from the operational documents. In its place, containment, monitoring, recovery, security. Anodyne goes bankrupt at the end of 2008. Another structure takes over the site. The names change. The fences remain. Gumption empties out. The hotels lose the families. The shops lose the lines. But the place is not abandoned. It is watched. Guards, technicians, contractors, containment crews. Tourism dies. Control takes its place. Years later, alerts still continue in the eastern Permian Basin. The biological question remains open. What species? What origin? What real size? How long has it been there? The file does not close those questions. It only shows what was built while waiting for answers. Railings, schedules, rooms, maps, instructions. And that phrase printed onto the world, "You are here." The park closed. The body remained. You have been listening to Strange Archives. If this file stayed with you, subscribe to the channel. The next one will open another archive that might have been better left sealed.